Hello and welcome to Content Area Research Group 2, Literacy in the Science Classroom. I am Denise and I'm going to be presenting the first portion of our presentation to you. Our project also includes information about the disciplinary literacy science classroom, the literacy demands of the science classroom, different texts that are utilized within science classes, English language learners within the science classroom, and Joanne will be talking to you later about new literacies, the roles of the literacy coach in a science classroom with the classroom teacher, as well as informational communication technologies and the next generation standards that impact science instruction. So I wanted to start off with this quote that I found on the Wisconsin Foundation for Disciplinary Literacy website. Communication, thinking, speaking, listening, reading, and writing in science allows us to consider our prior knowledge and explore new perspective while we ask scientific questions, make sense of data, explain and defend our reasoning as we interact with the natural and designed world. And I thought this was really relevant to the science classroom and especially younger students in the science classroom because as teachers, one of the things that we do want to impart on our students is the ability to ask questions and the ability to defend our thought process. Despite the content area, we want our students to be able to understand why answers are what they are, and we want them to be able to communicate their knowledge and their understanding. And more importantly, if they don't understand something, we want to be able to teach them how to communicate. So I feel like that really is a pivotal role as a literacy teacher or as a reading specialist, despite the content area, to teach students how to communicate with each other and to be able to communicate their understanding of a content area. So what does the disciplinary literacy science classroom look like? Obviously time and structure with student-centered lessons and questioning and a high level of student engagement. Of course, we always want students to be working together and to be engaged with the text and with each other. And from Content Matters, one of the interesting aspects that they brought up was, again, this concept of engagement with students. So learning activities, assignments, and assessments all work together cohesively to engage students in the learning process while deepening their content knowledge. It also states in the text that it is important to note that, of course, students are not scientists themselves, and science education has a different goal than the goals of science. Rather, they are students of learning and students of learning about science while they're spending their time in the classroom. And for science education for K through 12 students, primarily it really is about helping them understand the content or core subject matter of the disciplines of science and the nature of science as well. So creating a lesson in the disciplinary literacy science classroom, from this graphic that's from the Science Teacher Journal, really it's about supporting that student engagement. So how do we design lessons that really incorporate student interaction and activity with each other, create a collaborative conversation that leads to thoughtful and informed writing, and again to make sure that students are asking questions and are communicating in the classroom. So literacy demands of the disciplinary literacy science classroom. When I thought about this concept, I really came up with one question that sort of weaved its way into a lot of the readings that I did and a lot of the research that I found. How can science classroom teachers create an environment that promotes literacy within such a difficult area? So some of the ways in which literacy coaches and classroom teachers can do this is through aiding students in their question asking, so making it an inquiry-based classroom environment, helping them learn how to hypothesize. Of course, they're creating experiments, so they have to make predictions. And of course, after the experiments, they're interpreting the data and they're basing their responses in evidence that they have found. So that's always important in making sense of what the question is asking the students to do, and in making sure students understand what it is they're being required to do. So how can science classroom teachers create this environment? So of course we always want solid answers as teachers. We want to know what it is we can create to guide students in this way. So some of the strategies for meeting literacy demands include activities like our KWL charts, which are classic and always useful, creating anticipation guides in order to activate vocabulary and prior knowledge for students, graphic organizers to help students organize the information that they do discover, and to create a go-to piece of work where students can refer later on if they need to include some of that same information. So we know that reading, of course, is critical for scientific thinking, and the foundation for many of these skills that these students acquire are the same skills that scientists and even engineers utilize. So it's important for students to know why it is that we're asking the questions that we ask and how their understanding and their literacy can really guide them later on. So English language learners in the disciplinary literacy science classroom, from the article Understanding Language, some of the areas where teachers can support science and language for English language learners include literacy strategies and language support strategies. From this same article, Understanding Language, they also discuss how language intensive the science content area is. And this can apply to a number of things. Students might have to interpret the meaning of models, they support claims with evidence, communicate arguments, discuss phenomena and scientific principles, all of which comes with its own vocabulary and its own sort of dialect in and of itself just because of the content area. One of the issues that English language learners struggle with is the concept of how one word can have multiple meanings depending on the context. So the word like table they use as an example. There can be a water table, a data table, a kitchen table. Where do all of these definitions come into play within the science classroom can really become an issue for English language learners, despite their level of understanding of the English language. When placed in the content area like science, it adds on layers of difficulty and meaning for them. So what we have to do is to aid in these different discourse strategies that we can give them, different ways to model certain words or certain pieces of vocabulary to help them comprehend dense and diverse texts that they see in these types of settings. And the Next Generation Science Standards and the Common Core State Standards all encourage educators to really help develop English language learners' language and literacy in the context of different subject matters. So carefully selecting texts that support students in all literacies and in all levels, which is what I will be getting to in a couple of slides, is one of the ways we can aid English language learners in the science classroom. So according to Understanding Language, English language learners would face more difficulty than other students we'd already discussed in vocabulary. In the discourse, again, so the level and mode of communication in which you discuss these concepts with them, and the modes of representation. So according to Understanding Language, really it's not that science teachers should function as language teachers, but rather supporters of the language learning that occurs in such a content-dense and content-rich classroom environment like science. So talking about some of the texts that can support teachers in the classroom, popular textbook and primary scientific literature are our three primary sources of communication and of information, each of which, of course, has its own purpose depending on what the content area is currently focusing on. And some of the questions for different scientific texts in the classroom for textbook include things like, what are the headings? That's typically how our textbooks are organized. They're relatively uniform in terms of how information is disseminated to students and how it's organized on a page. Primary scientific literature, that includes magazines and journals. So what is the claim being made by the author? Typically, when they're writing these articles of some kind, they have some stance about whatever the topic is they're discussing, so students need to be able to identify what the claim is that they're making. Is it biased or not? Popular texts, questions like what is the science phenomenon that's being discussed, and again, questions like what is the source, really help to guide students in understanding why the article is discussing this topic in the way it is. And all of these help students to understand point of view. They help to understand why certain texts will reveal certain bits of information while others will not, all expanding their understanding of literacy despite the source. So just to wrap up our scientific text discussion, textbooks we've all seen before. Our popular texts include science magazines and journals, primary scientific literature, academic journal articles, and the like. And trade books, which are being introduced more into the classroom, again, to aid in that general literacy and understanding for students, not just for English language learners, but for students with lower literacy understanding, and again to expand on the mode of comprehension and the way in which students are asked to identify certain elements in the content area. Different trade books can really help students understand even difficult texts. So Joanne is going to go ahead and discuss incorporating new literacies like trade books and text in the science classroom. Utilizing internet resources, nonfiction and fiction works are also some of the ways in which we can incorporate different types of text in the classroom. And she's going to go into more detail about the standards and the requirements based on these new literacies that are really evolving in the classroom. I just wanted to end with another quote from the Wisconsin Literacy website. Educators help students recognize and understand the nuances of a discipline by using strategies that make their thinking visible. And I think it's really important that we focus on that visibility portion of learning. We know as teachers that students do learn in different ways, and aiding in their literacy in such a difficult content area really helps when they can see what they're learning and when they are able to make their thinking visible to them as well as to other people. So I think that was an important concept to think about as I continued on in my research. All right, thanks for listening and hope you enjoyed it.